This week's challenge comes to us from Raphael Lataster, Disaster, I don't know. He's the author of There Was No Jesus, There Is No God, which that's going to be an important point here, that he's the author of that. He wrote an article for the Washington Post against the existence of Jesus, but he makes a number of claims in this article. In fact, I think too many to deal with kind of in a short response video, but I do want to kind of locate the central, I think, claims that we want to deal with in this article. And let me just read to you this paragraph that really kind of sums up the key part of this particular challenge. He says, the first problem we encounter when trying to discover more about the historical Jesus is the lack of early sources. The earliest sources only reference the clearly fictional Christ of faith. These early sources, compiled decades after the alleged events, all stem from Christian authors eager to promote Christianity, which gives us reason to question them. The authors of the gospel fail to name themselves, describe their qualifications, or show any criticism with their foundational sources. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of it. And so I want to key in on two particular issues up front because I think they're pretty central. Number one, there's this implication that, and I guess it's not just an implication, he just explicitly states it, that these writers of the Gospels are eager to promote Christianity, and therefore we can't trust them. Right? So this is the whole issue of bias. If the Christian writers actually believe this stuff is true, then they're biased in such a way that you can't trust them. Well, if that claim is correct, guess what? We can't trust Raphael either. Is Raphael biased? Does he believe what he writes? I mean, he's the author of a book that wants to argue there is no Jesus and there is no God. So does he want to promote that point of view? Of course. If that's the case, we shouldn't believe him based on his own criterion here, right? And when people say that, the gospel writers are biased and therefore they shouldn't be trusted. Well, if that's the case, no one should be trusted because we all have our biases. And what does it mean to be biased? Does it mean that you think something is true or that you even, you have something invested in this? What does that mean? That applies, it's going to apply to all of us. I think what Raphael writes, he thinks is true. But if that means it's a bias that disqualifies the gospel writers, it would disqualify him as well. No, I don't think that's the case. Just because you want to promote something, it doesn't follow that you can't be trusted. In fact, people will tell you, historians will tell you that some of the most careful historical work, right, on the Holocaust is done by Jews. Talk about people who would be quote unquote biased, right, who have, a real interest in this. Well, it's actually, you could argue that it's their bias that helps them to preserve accurate history. They want to be very careful so that the world never loses kind of the lessons learned from that. So bias doesn't mean they can't be trusted. It doesn't mean they're simply trying to promote their view and therefore what they're writing is not true. If that were the case, it would apply to Raphael as well. There's a second issue here, and it's the issue of gospel authorship. Right, he wants to call that into question. And, the traditional view is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. But clearly, this can't be the case. They don't identify themselves within their Gospels. So let's kind of deal with that claim and the issue of authorship. A couple things right off the bat. Number one, these are ancient biographies. And when you look at other biographies outside of the Gospels, not all biographers name themselves in their work. So this wasn't uncommon. Number two, if they don't name themselves, and certainly there are works in the New Testament where, for Paul, for instance, names himself, okay? But if they don't name themselves, then we have to look for other traditions or sources to help us construct a case for why we'd think, okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the authors. And actually, we have some good historical sources that give us good reason to think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the authors of the Gospels. Number one, you have very early tradition on this, Christian tradition, but remember what I said in answering that whole bias issue. You can't throw this out just because they're Christians. But you got Irenaeus, who identifies the gospel writers. You actually have earlier testimony. You've got Eusebius, referring to Papias, and you've got material that goes back to end of first century, beginning of second century, that identifies these guys as the gospel writers. So you have some early sources on that. You have kind of this uniformity of tradition amongst the early church. I mean, there's no other competing traditions on this. You look at the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament. When it's identified, the gospel writers, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so those are good reasons to think that these are the original writers. The claim is that these are this is the early church wanting to kind of elevate these documents and give them some credibility. And so we're going to attach we're going to attach disciples to it. We're going to give these things credibility by putting some big names on there. Well, think about it. Okay, of course, Matthew and John are part of the 12, but let's set them aside and let's take Mark and Luke, right? And so you want to lend credibility to the biography here of Jesus, so you attach Mark and Luke. Well, why would you do that? What's more plausible here, that we've attached, the early churches attached these names to it because this is going to lend more credibility? Well, think about who Mark is, right? Mark is someone who, who went with Paul on a mission and then kind of midway through bailed. He's like, I think I'm done with this. Mark is the one who caused a major rift between Paul and Barnabas. Is that the guy that you're going to want to say, hey, here's an authoritative source? And I mean, think about it. We know that Mark relies upon Peter for his eyewitness material and accounts. So why would you put Mark on the name of the gospel when you can just go right to Peter? I mean, if you want some credibility, go to Peter, not Mark. So it seems implausible that the early church is going to put Mark on there to try and bolster this. And Luke, what about Luke? I mean, a companion of Paul, but relatively unknown. I mean, there are other guys, it seems like in the early church, that were companions of Paul. You could stick their name on there and give more credibility. And so it doesn't seem plausible. It seems less plausible that the early church would just kind of, make up the authors in such a fashion. No, because of all these things, we have good reason to think that these are the authors of the gospel. Okay, again, there's a lot more here, a lot more claims that we'd have to deal with. It would take more time to deal with. But I think we've dealt with the two kind of foundational things. No, bias doesn't mean these things are unreliable. And yes, we have good reason to think that the authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And now we can start looking more carefully, particularly at the historical details, and then construct a case that yes, Jesus did exist, and yes, he is who he claimed to be.